It is 2:14 a.m. on a rain-swept Tuesday in Windsor. The perimeter alarms of Royal Lodge have been deliberately deactivated, not by intruders, but by the Crown Estate's elite internal security force. What you are looking at is the exact moment a royal prince was physically escorted from the property he swore he would never leave. We have obtained exclusive confirmation that King Charles III did not just ask his brother to vacate. He signed an emergency writ of sequestration. Royal protection officers physically changed the brass locks on the 30-room mansion while the Duke of York was ordered into a waiting vehicle. But the real story isn't that Andrew was kicked out into the cold night. The real story is the terrifying financial discovery that forced the King's hand. Before we expose the secret offshore funding network keeping the Duke afloat, impress that like button and subscribe to the channel, because the royal family desperately wants this buried. The flashing blue lights of unmarked police vehicles cut through the thick fog, casting long, distorted shadows across the ancient, crumbling facade of Royal Lodge. Rain hammers relentlessly against the tinted glass of black Range Rovers, forming a barricade around the perimeter. This is not a polite royal relocation. This is a siege. For decades, Royal Lodge stood as an impregnable fortress of privilege, a sprawling 30-room monument to the untouchable status of Queen Elizabeth's favourite son. But tonight, that untouchable illusion shatters completely. Heavily armed royal protection officers, acting under the direct and uncompromising orders of the reigning monarch, are executing a dormant 19th-century royal prerogative to forcefully reclaim sovereign territory. The heavy oak doors, barred from the inside for months of bitter defiance, are breached. Brass locks that have secured the Duke of York sanctuary are physically drilled out and replaced in the dead of night. Inside, a disgraced prince is given a timeline measured in minutes to gather whatever he can carry before being ordered into a waiting, idling vehicle. The sheer physicality of the removal is breathtaking, a brutal and permanent severing of royal indulgence. Yet, the physical eviction is merely the explosive climax of a much darker, far more dangerous conspiracy. The palace has spun a narrative of property management, of right-sizing the royal portfolio. That is a lie. The real catalyst for this unprecedented midnight raid is a terrifying financial discovery, a labyrinthine offshore money trail that threatened to drag the entire British monarchy into an international scandal of catastrophic proportions. To understand the sheer, ruthless violence of this midnight raid, we must rewind the clock exactly 72 days. It was a brisk, cloudless Tuesday morning when the trap was supposed to finally snap shut. For months, King Charles had been waging a quiet, bloodless war of attrition against his brother. The strategy devised within the heavily guarded walls of Clarence House was simple and elegant. Starve him out. The palace had deliberately and surgically slashed Prince Andrew's £249,000 annual allowance. The king's inner circle of financial advisors operated under the absolute assumption that without the steady, lucrative drip of the sovereign grant, the Duke would inevitably collapse under his own financial weight. The math was indisputable. Royal Lodge is a behemoth, a historic estate requiring a staggering £400,000 a year just in basic maintenance to keep the damp out of the walls and the roof from caving in. The king knew his brother's legitimate income streams had evaporated, alongside his public reputation. The strategy was to let the rotting walls of Royal Lodge do the dirty work. Charles was prepared to wait as the peeling paint and crumbling masonry eventually forced his bankrupt brother into an embarrassing surrender. Also, they thought. The palace's flawless strategy was violently derailed when, against all rational economic logic, Prince Andrew inexplicably summoned an elite team of scaffolding contractors to initiate a massive, comprehensive repair of the estate's sprawling roof. Fleet after fleet of heavy construction vehicles rolled through the Windsor gates, carrying tons of expensive materials and demanding immediate, exorbitant cash payments. Deep inside Buckingham Palace, the royal accountants were absolutely paralysed. The numbers simply did not make sense. The Duke of York, a man completely stripped of his royal titles, banished from public life, and utterly devoid of any visible means of massive corporate income, was suddenly flashing unlimited, untraceable capital. He was not just surviving the king's financial siege, he was aggressively mocking it. Panic began to spread through the king's highest ranks of advisors. A disgraced, financially desperate prince, with access to millions of sudden, unexplained pounds, is the ultimate nightmare for the crown. It meant Andrew was no longer merely a stubborn squatter clinging to his mother's memory. He was the beneficiary of a shadow operation. The realization struck Clarence House like a physical blow. Where was this tidal wave of cash coming from? Who exactly was silently funding the most toxic member of the royal family? Was it a foreign oligarch? A shadowy syndicate buying future leverage? Or something far more sinister? The king realized that his brother's defiant stand at Royal Lodge was not funded by scraped-together savings, but by a highly sophisticated, deeply concealed financial network designed to bypass the crown's oversight entirely. This terrifying realization triggered the most aggressive forensic accounting investigation in modern royal history. The king authorized the deployment of elite financial investigators, bypassing standard royal auditors to trace the origin of Andrew's mysterious windfall. The deeper they dug, the darker the reality became. They were hunting a ghost in the machine, tracing a series of meticulously layered shell companies and blind trusts designed specifically to mask the identity of the primary benefactor. The Duke had essentially weaponized his royal connections, finding an invisible backer willing to float a king's ransom just to keep him fortified within Royal Lodge. For the monarchy, this was not just embarrassing, it was an existential security threat. If a foreign entity or a compromised billionaire held the financial leash of the king's brother, the entire institution was vulnerable to catastrophic blackmail. The king's strategy of attrition had failed spectacularly, replaced by an urgent, ticking time bomb of financial espionage. The battle for Royal Lodge had ceased to be a mere family real estate dispute. It had mutated into a desperate, high-stakes proxy war to neutralize a compromised prince before his dark money network could irreversibly contaminate the crown. The king needed a weapon, a legal nuclear option to shatter Andrew's defenses and drag him out of the shadows. And deep within the dusty, forgotten archives of the royal vault, they were about to find exactly what they needed. Deep within the labyrinthine subterranean archives beneath London, a team of specialized constitutional barristers unearthed a relic of legal warfare. It arrived at the king's private desk at Clarence House, not as an email or a whispered rumor, but as a heavy 150-page memorandum bound in formidable dark blue leather. The solid thud of that dossier hitting the polished mahogany surface signaled the beginning of the end for the Duke of York. Our deepest insiders, heavily embedded within the shadow machinery of the Privy Council, have leaked the exact contents of this devastating financial dossier. The pages inside are a wasteland of heavily redacted financial ledgers juxtaposed against the yellowed, brittle parchment of a nearly forgotten legal covenant, the Crown Estate Indemnity Clause of 1937. The technical jargon bleeding across these pages is chilling in its absolute, unforgiving precision. It outlines, with surgical clarity, a complex web of corporate obfuscation. The investigators had successfully pierced the corporate veil of the scaffolding contractors, tracing the massive influx of capital back through a dizzying maze of holding companies registered in tax havens across the Caribbean, before finally hitting the source. The money was flowing from a highly secure revolving offshore trust, an entity heavily shielded by international banking secrecy laws, but ultimately traced back to an unnamed, ultra-wealthy benefactor operating out of the Middle East. This was the smoking gun. This was the exact leverage the king had been desperately waiting for. The trap was not merely financial. It was deeply, constitutionally legal. Under the incredibly strict, uncompromising covenants established by the 2003 Crown Estate Lease Act. A working royal, or any resident of sovereign-owned property, is strictly forbidden from accepting undeclared, third-party subsidies for the maintenance of Crown assets. The property belongs to the sovereign, and allowing a foreign entity or an anonymous billionaire to pump millions into its foundations is legally classified as compromising the integrity of the Crown estate itself. King Charles's top legal advisors, armed with the devastating contents of this 150-page memorandum, realized instantly that Prince Andrew had not just been squandering money or acting entitled. He had committed a fundamental, irreversible breach of his lease. By funneling dark money into the restoration of Royal Lodge, Andrew had crossed a red line that even his late mother could not have forgiven. The king's legal mercenaries now had the absolute constitutional gunpowder they needed to blow Andrew's lease agreement to ash. The dossier proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the Duke York was not just broke, he was hopelessly compromised. He was an active liability, functioning as an unwitting proxy for undisclosed foreign wealth, directly on the grounds of Windsor Great Park. The legal machinery of the British monarchy, notoriously slow and bureaucratic, was suddenly thrown into absolute overdrive, transforming into a lethal weapon aimed directly at the king's own brother. Exactly 72 hours before the midnight raid shattered the peace of Royal Lodge, a final, brutal reckoning took place. It happened behind the massive, soundproofed oak doors of the King's Library at Clarence House, a room suffocating with history and heavy with the scent of old paper and beeswax. We have obtained the exact, unvarnished details of that confrontation, a meeting so intensely toxic that palace staff were ordered to clear the entire corridor. The afternoon sun cut through the tall windows, illuminating dancing dust motes in an otherwise perfectly still room, setting a haunting stage for the destruction of a brotherly bond. Prince Andrew sat slumped in a massive, antique leather wingback chair, his posture a mixture of arrogant defiance and simmering panic. His hands gripped the polished armrests with such terrifying force that his knuckles turned a stark, translucent white, the blood entirely draining from his fingers. Standing opposite him, silhouetted against the grand marble fireplace, was King Charles III. The king did not shout. He did not lose his temper. He simply stood there, radiating the cold, detached authority of a sovereign who has finally excised all familial sentiment from his duty. In his hands, he held the dark blue leather financial dossier. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like the walls were closing in. Without a word, Charles stepped forward and dropped the eviction mandate onto the table between them. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot. Witnesses standing guard on the other side of the oak doors report that the ensuing explosion of rage from the Duke was palpable even through the soundproofing. Andrew's face turned violently crimson, a deep, furious red, with thick, bloodshot veins visibly pulsing and straining at his temples. He lunged forward in the leather chair, his voice cracking under the immense strain of his own indignation as he realized the absolute finality of the document before him. "You are destroying our mother's legacy," Andrew reportedly spat, his words dripping with venom and desperate entitlement, attempting to weaponize the memory of Queen Elizabeth one final, futile time. But the king was entirely impervious to the emotional manipulation that had shielded Andrew for 6 decades. Charles did not flinch. He did not step back. Instead, leaning slightly over the table, his voice dropping to a glacial, terrifying whisper that cut through Andrew's rage like a scalpel, the king delivered the final blow. "No, Andrew," Charles replied, his eyes locked onto his brother with predatory stillness. "I am saving the crown from you." The physical tension inside the library escalated to such a dangerous, suffocating degree that the royal equerry stationed strictly outside the doors felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The atmospheric pressure of the confrontation was so thick, so violently unstable, that this highly trained security professional instinctively reached down and placed a trembling hand firmly on his radio, fully prepared to call in a royal protection team to physically separate the king and the duke. It was the moment the brother died, and only the monarch remained. The mandate on the table was not a negotiation tactic. It was not a warning. It was a signed, sealed execution of Andrew's royal existence. The Middle Eastern Trust, the dark money, the massive scaffolding operation, it had all been exposed, mapped out, and weaponized by the king's lawyers. Andrew looked down at the documents, the realization slowly washing over him that his impenetrable fortress of arrogance had just been razed to the ground. He had been outmaneuvered, outfunded, and legally obliterated. The brotherly leniency he had relied on his entire life had run dry, replaced by the ruthless, self-preserving machinery of a crown that had finally deemed him too toxic to survive. There is absolutely no coming back from the administrative violence of what happened next. The king did not merely sign a standard eviction notice to be delivered by a mid-level estate manager. He invoked a writ of reversion, a devastating, centuries-old legal maneuver designed specifically to strip a rogue noble of their territorial strongholds. Deep within the fortified walls of Buckingham Palace, in a room sealed off from all public records, a heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen scratched violently across thick, archival parchment. Oiling red wax was poured onto the bottom of the document, and the heavy brass royal seal was pressed deeply into it, crystallizing a permanent, undeniable decree. The resounding thud of a massive, steel-reinforced vault door closing echoed through the subterranean corridors, locking the newly signed edict away from any possible legal appeal. In a highly classified, emergency session of the Privy Council, documented only in a heavily guarded, sealed addendum, the ultimate sanction was silently executed. The Duke of York's name was not just removed, it was permanently, irrevocably struck from the sovereign grant ledger with a single stroke of black ink. The financial umbilical cord to the British monarchy was severed completely. But the king's merciless purge did not stop at mere finances or real estate. In a move that sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of the aristocracy, the original letters patent governing the creation of the York dukedom itself were quietly extracted from the royal archives and placed under aggressive internal review. The implication is staggering and historically unprecedented. The king is actively exploring the constitutional mechanisms required to strip the York title entirely, reducing his brother from a royal duke to a disgraced, titled commoner. The verdict handed down from the Crown estate is absolute. They have forcefully reclaimed Royal Lodge, and the legal finality of this midnight siege is entirely irreversible. Prince Andrew has been meticulously erased from the operational archives of the active monarchy, transformed overnight into a living ghost haunting the periphery of the royal machine. Yet, as the dawn breaks over Windsor Great Park, illuminating the newly installed heavy-duty security barricades blocking the sweeping driveway of Royal Lodge, a new and far more dangerous chapter begins. Prince Andrew has been officially banished to a minor, heavily downgraded property, a bleak, uninviting brick structure practically swallowed by the surrounding dense forest. He stands alone in the freezing rain, stripped of his sprawling fortress, his royal protection officers replaced by private, low-level security contractors who watch his every move with suspicion rather than respect. The mighty Duke of York has been reduced to a mere spectator of his own life. Locked out of the very institution he believed he was fundamentally entitled to rule. But if King Charles believes this brutal eviction has neutralized the threat, he is tragically mistaken. The storm surrounding the House of Windsor is far from over. In fact, the most devastating hurricane is only just forming on the horizon. Remember that labyrinthine offshore trust, the deeply concealed financial network that paralyzed the palace accountants and forced the king's hand in the dead of night? The delayed revelation of that dark money trail holds a secret so explosive it threatens to tear the monarchy apart from the inside out. Our investigative team has bypassed the encrypted firewalls of the Caribbean holding companies, and we have uncovered a single, highly classified name secretly attached to the master ledger of that offshore account as a secondary beneficiary. It is a name that instantly threatens to drag the next generation of royals directly into the merciless crossfire of this fraternal war. From the shadows of this unprecedented royal collapse emerges the silhouette of Princess Beatrice. She is no longer just the dutiful daughter watching her father's public humiliation. She is now the undisputed custodian of the York family's darkest, most heavily guarded financial secrets. Standing in the dimly lit study of her private residence, clutching a thick, heavily classified file containing the unredacted offshore ledgers, the princess represents the ultimate wildcard in this royal Game of Thrones. What exactly does the princess know about the anonymous Middle Eastern benefactor, who kept her father's fortress afloat? Is she merely an innocent pawn courting the crossfire of her uncle's ruthless purge? Or is she the silent architect of a financial contingency plan designed to protect the York bloodline at all costs? The palace is holding its breath, absolutely terrified of the leverage she now possesses. The king may have successfully severed the head of the snake by physically removing Andrew, but he has inadvertently backed the entire York family into a desperate, suffocating corner. And history dictates that a cornered, wounded animal is at its most lethal right before it decides to bite back. Beatrice has the means, she has the motive, and she holds the encrypted financial keys that could expose the crown's deepest vulnerabilities to the global press. The king's war against his brother has just evolved into a terrifying generational conflict, and the collateral damage will be entirely uncontainable. Do not dare look away, because the royal family's worst nightmare is about to become public record. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications, because our next exclusive video drops the complete, unredacted contents of that Middle Eastern offshore ledger, exposing exactly who is funding the York revenge plot. The siege of Royal Lodge was only the beginning. The real war for the crown starts now.